Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Harper, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
I'm Professor David Harper. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London in the UK, and my kind of day job is I'm co-director of a professional doctorate in clinical psychology. So we train clinical psychologists for the National Health Service in the UK.
How'd you get interested in, because I came across some of your work about MkUltra, and it's what I wanted to talk to you about, but how did you come across MkUltra? Was that just through, like, was that from your career? Like, did you just learn about it? Or like, because I didn't learn about it until I think I got out of the education system and then started kind of looking into topics on the show.
I think it was years ago actually. It was in the 1970s. I remember picking up a book in a kind of one of those where you get those reduced paperback volumes, and there was Walter Boart's book, Operation Mind Control, and that had just been after the CIA had released a load of documents following the kind of Freedom of Information Act. I don't remember MkUltra from that time, but it was basically all the experiments that we're going to kind of talk about today. And then when I was an undergraduate in psychology in the mid-80s, I did a course in the history of psychology, and as part of that, you had to do like a bit of research and do a presentation. And I was interested in the politics of psychology, and I ended up having a look at a book called, I think it's called War on the Mind. I can't remember the name of the author now, but it was a journalist, and he was talking a lot about the use of, again, some of those experiments, but also the use of psychology and interrogations, in particularly in Northern Ireland, where the British Army and British security services have been active for the last few decades. So that was my initial interest, and then I wrote a short article once I graduated on the politics of psychology in a small magazine here in the UK. And at the time, it seemed just a bit of aspects of history that was never going to be relevant again. And then obviously after 9/11, and then the journalists started to report that there were these black interrogation sites and there were enhanced interrogation techniques. And basically they were using all of this stuff from the past. And I thought, oh my God, this is like a bit depressing that this is all relevant again, because, the British government suspended those interrogations at I can't remember, in the 1970s, I think. And it was a bit depressing that, the Bush administration were pushing ahead with exactly the same techniques that have been, found to be immoral breaches of human rights in the past. And I know there was a big debate in the US at the time, and lots of psychologists, ended up, making exactly the same mistakes as lots of people had in the past. So yes, that was my interest in it. Yeah, so it kind of predates my professional training in psychology.
Were you surprised about the kind of the political divide with the whole psychiatric community? I mean, did you come across a lot of that? Like I've come across through documents of things, but like they're supposed to end everything after like the Rockefeller Commission is what I've seen in documents, which was like LSD interrogations and things of that sort. But then I've seen later documents that are like, let's say if that one's 65 or something, I've seen documents in 71 that talk about you can revive things from the Rockefeller Commission of LSD interrogations to get the answers that you need. And I'm just like, well, that's a really unethical thing, not just reviving old stuff, but also you're messing with someone's mind. And I think that's where my interest comes in. Like I went to school for psychology. I didn't end up continuing going to college just because after I got my associate's degree, I was like, I'm good with this. Wanted to learn in my own form. But to me, that's like a very sensitive subject because the mind is so fragile. And I don't know if it's exactly an exact science, but you can look up plenty of these I would call them basic experiments on YouTube, like the milligram experiments up there. I think one would shock people. They don't actually shock them, though. They just kind of put people to a test. That stuff's very interesting. The Stanford prison experiment is interesting. But when you start talking about infusing drugs and then kind of really warping the public's consciousness, like some of the stuff I've learned about MKUltra, I have a hard line. And it just seems like, they haven't fully tossed it out of the mix yet. It's proven effective into the government. If it's effective, never fully toss it out, just low key, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising. I mean, to be honest, it was being allowed. I mean, it's always easy to kind of to focus on the people who end up doing it. But I think it's worth remembering. And now, compared to Trump, everybody thinks that the George Bush administration were, not so bad. But I mean, particularly Dick Cheney, it's a politically led thing where they were saying, we need to take the gloves off now. And there was, I think, a kind of arrogance, a failure to learn from history, really. I mean, US soldiers were court-martialed, during the Vietnam War for waterboarding people. So to suddenly say that's okay now seemed to be just kind of crazy, really. So yeah, I was very surprised to see those kind of techniques being brought up. I mean, the other thing is, it wasn't a big divide within psychology and psychiatry. It was a minority of psychologists who ended up doing this, many of whom weren't really professionally practicing psychologists. I mean, the two key figures, who ended up designing the program for the CIA, were consultants. I mean, they were consultants for escape and evasion. I mean, they were not experts in interrogation. I mean, they were experts in helping, US military, particularly pilots who might get captured, in adversary territory, helping them to kind of resist interrogation. And then they reverse engineered all these techniques. And they just ended up making, apart from the ethics of it, which is deeply unethical, and it breaches all kinds of, accepted national and international norms. I mean, the lawyers and the Bush administration decided that torture, was not what the international community thought torture was. They said torture was anything that led to organ failure. Well, once you start saying that, then any mental technique is okay. Because unless you're going to torture somebody to death or cause them to, lose the function of an organ, that's a very, very, a much lower threshold for harsher techniques than was normally accepted. So that was all depressing, really. So
were those people that were like with the small minority group that was agreeing with going with the CIA and helping them out, were they like thinking of it as patriots of the community, of like doing your government a favor and helping them out in these types of ways? Because that can be, I mean, a sketchy road to try and, assume that's what the person thought. But talking with Stephen Kinzer, when he was talking about the biography of not Stephen Kinzer, Sidney Gottlieb, he said, looking through this file, like you hear the historical record and then you look at his journals and then what he was able to find out. He wasn't viewing it like how we view it. He was viewing it, this is work and this is what they tasked me to do, and I'm going to finish my job, which I'm not saying it takes weight off of the whole severity of the MkUltra project, but it's just a different insight. And I would have to think that if everybody knew like the unethics of this, like horrors that could lead to, I think a lot of people wouldn't sign up for it. But it's also, if you redact somebody's name, then they're like, well, technically I'm not a part of it because my name's not written down.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to kind of speculate about the kind of, the motivations of the people involved. I mean, I think one thing that, the kind of social context at the time, both in the 1950s and 60s during the early Cold War and post 9/11, I think fear was a major factor. And, fear drives people to do things that, are maybe not that ethical, particularly fear where there isn't any public accountability. Because I think both with the Gottlieb, funded, the MkUltra program, and also in the post 9/11 enhanced interrogation program and high value detainee programs, these were not publicly visible. All of this stuff was happening, behind closed doors. I mean, there were leaks to the media, but for the most part, it was without accountability. And the public were also very afraid. And the difficulty is that some of the assumptions underlying torture kind of come through. So, if you've read, I've read some of the accounts by military interrogators, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were kind of starting from the assumption that the people who were being brought to them were clearly guilty, even though they were usually, being given up for ransoms being paid. So, the people were being picked up by, militia groups for all kinds of reasons. Maybe somebody had fallen out with somebody else, but they were coming in with the assumption that they were guilty of something, and then their job was really to kind of grind the person down physically and mentally to find out, what they knew. But that's the kind of wrong way to start. I mean, within kind of law enforcement interrogations where you're trying to build some kind of rapport with the person, and there are lots of, in the UK, we have something called the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And what that means is that there are certain things you can't do. And the idea of that is to prevent people making false testimony against themselves. For instance, forensic psychologists know there's a thing called suggestibility, and it's very easy to get people to remember something that didn't actually happen by asking leading questions, by planting, either intentionally or unintentionally, ideas in people's minds. And also, there's an awful lot of people who falsely give themselves up, to the police when they weren't anywhere near and they've got alibis. So, managing suggestibility is a really, really important thing. And in none of this, the discussion about the enhanced interrogation techniques or early on, with the MkUltra program, was anybody thinking about the danger of false confessions. And also, when you're torturing people, whether that's psychologically or physically, people will say lots of different things, some of which may be true, some of which may not be true. And actually, the difficulty is working out what's true from what's not true, and then you would hear accounts of, somebody in a black site had, given details about some kind of operation to some terrorist operation. But, these were usually like things said very indirectly that people were making a whole load out of. And usually when investigators looked at it, anything that was true had already been gained already. I mean, the FBI came out with lots of examples where, they'd already gained information at this. I can't remember the name of the, I think a Lebanese interpreter working with the FBI who was involved in some of the arrests of the Al Qaeda leaders, leading operatives, and he'd already got, through a kind of rapport-based interrogation with some of the leading people, he'd already got the information that the CIA later claimed they only got through harsher methods. So yeah, I think that the basic problems are, the assumptions that the interrogators within these black sites and other places, that the assumptions they started off with were wrong. And it often, owed more to popular culture, the idea of the kind of ticking bomb situation where, you say this person knows where a bomb is placed, and therefore we should use any means necessary to get the information out of them. But those situations are like from novels and from films that don't really occur in real life, and you've no idea whether the person knows, the details of an operation. You don't know whether those details have changed. So it's extremely unlikely that you're ever going to be in that situation. And the danger is that people tend to forget the risks that are involved, the risk that people are just going to make stuff up, the risk that, it's going to be difficult to tell what's true from what's not true.
You're telling me those Mission Impossible movies were fake the whole time?
Yeah. You're just waiting for somebody to rip the mask off.
I have to ask about some of the experiments that you looked into. I think a lot of my knowledge is going to be more in the past. I think it was a little bit shocking to me. I know I saw, like I said, some of your interviews like about the 9/11, but some of the more Iraq like war stuff, that stuff's a little bit new to me, and it's a little bit shocking. And I'm sure it is for a lot of people out there that will be listening to this, about that still happening more today as well too. But it makes sense, only because, like I said, it's effective and they found it effective, so they just keep on using it. They don't really ever stop. But there's a huge, I would think an oversight committee would come in, but I'm curious to some of the experiments that you have that you looked into that were able to, maybe give me a couple examples just so I can, because like I said, all my examples will be from past. I mean, we could talk about Operation Midnight Climax, which I think is nuts. But then there's other ones as well too. I read a journal of a person who was under Ewen Cameron and talked about being in a hole and their eyes and ears were covered, and it felt like what was being dumped on was snakes dumped on top of them. I don't know, remember exactly, because it's been a few years now, if they were exactly snakes or it just felt like that because the person had been given something. But to me, it's just like they went from torturing people that they considered an enemy to just finding people in institutions and being like, well, what's this person? I mean, can't hurt, right? And then they just went after it, which is a huge concern for me.
Yeah. I mean, I should just say, just at the start, I mean, the Obama administration kind of banned the enhanced interrogation technique. So the only interrogation that's now supposed to be used by the military are the kind of previous things that are in the US Army Field Manual, I think. But, yeah, there may well be abuses, but those more enhanced things, and I don't believe there are black sites anymore. But yeah, in terms of the older experiments, so yeah, Ewen Cameron was originally a Scottish psychiatrist. He emigrated to Canada in the 40s or 50s, I think. There's actually a really good podcast series. I can send you the details where they looked at his history, and he kind of moved between Canada and the US. So at one point he was the president of the World Psychiatric Association and the president of the American Psychiatric Association, and he was originally he was actually at the Nuremberg war trials at the end of the Second World War. He was doing a report on oh my goodness, who was the Nazi who flew to England, who was
Not Warner
in
von Braun, was it?
no, the guy who was in Spandau prison for years and years and years in Berlin. His name escapes me, but he was a famous Nazi war criminal, and so he was aware. I mean, the bizarre thing about Ewen Cameron is, he was aware of all the things that the Nazis had done, including the kind of Nazi doctors, and yet, within 10 years, he was doing some of the most unethical experiments ever done, in psychiatric facilities. So yeah, I mean, his experiments kind of changed over time. I mean, if my memory serves me right, he'd actually started along this path before he received CIA funding. We still don't know whether he was aware that his research is being funded by the CIA. At the time, the CIA were funding a lot of this research through a kind of cover organization called I think it's called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which is based at Cornell University. And he had a long-standing interest. I mean, the podcast series, kind of reveals quite a lot about him. And I think he was quite interested in technology. He was quite interested in kind of science fiction ideas, and he had kind of rather grandiose ideas about changing, the public at large. And I think where he was starting from, and in fact, quite a few of the early researchers in this area had a kind of idea that you could basically wipe somebody's memory and personality like a blank screen, and then you could implant something new on top of that. And
Sleeper agent.
Sorry?
Sleeper agent, or
Yeah. But from a mental health point of view, I think Ewen Cameron thought you could kind of get rid of a kind of what he would regard as a maladaptive personality and build a positive new personality on top of that. I mean, they were incredibly crude and reductionist ideas. I mean, even at the time, lots of mental health researchers would disagree with some of those claims. I mean, the psychologist E.O. Harper, who's did lots of research in perception, did some of this research, but actually although he tends to get lumped in with this kind of research, I mean, his was with, students who gave informed consent. So they were kind of kept in sensory deprivation, which basically meant they were put in kind of cuffs that covered up, reduced their ability to sense. They were given visors, and they were kept in a place where there was restricted environmental stimulation, and what they just wanted to see what would happen if you reduced you basically deprived the senses. And what they found was that most students kind of left the experiments after 2 or 3 days because they were starting to hallucinate. Their mind was starting to break down in common parlance, and so they told students what was going to happen. They got informed consent, and they let students end the experiment when they wanted to. But it was very different with Ewen Cameron. In his experiments, which he had a series of different experiments, but kind of towards the end, he devised these. He had his own kind of jargon. One of the things was what he called de-patterning. And then he also had something called psychic driving. So his research was all done without any consent. So he never informed patients of what he was going to do. he never really gave them an option. He just told them he was going to give them treatment. And so these were people who were referred to him for, psychiatric treatment, and he just decided on his own to put them into a study, which was completely untested, and had huge risks, and he was just reckless in thinking about the potential side effects on them. So what he would do, I mean, he did different things at different times, but the kind of prototype kind of example would be he wanted to kind of wipe their previous kind of memories and personality, and he would do that by giving them multiple shocks of electroshock every day at very, very high rates, at like some of the highest rates that have ever been used in psychiatric research. And basically, people will be given tranquilizers as well at the same time. So they will be basically unconscious, in a coma, essentially, in a bed. They would be woken up to take them to the toilets, to give them food, and to give them electroshock, I think about 3 times a day at very high rates. And this would go on for, a couple of weeks, maybe longer. I mean, one person was given shocks, I think, for a month, over a month. And so basically, and in his research papers, he talks about the massive, because one of the side effects we know of electroshock is, memory problems. And he saw that, I mean, that was what he was aiming to do. He was trying to make them lose their memory. And then after that, he then used a technique he called psychic driving, which meant that he would play them repeated taped messages. And he used a variety of devices. Sometimes these were kind of in the headboards of the bed, but he also, a technician, created headphones inside a kind of football helmet, and it would be strapped on so that the person couldn't remove it. And there would be played these messages every day, all day, every day. And he would start off with negative messages. So these might be recordings from therapy sessions that Cameron had with the person, where the person may be saying, what a parent had said to them, maybe some negative things that they thought about themselves or that other people had said to them. So he'd play these messages repeatedly, again for days or potentially weeks long, and then he would use more positive messages. So this is where he was starting to try and instill what he thought was a kind of more positive personality. So again, these might be positive messages that they'd mentioned in therapy meetings, maybe things that Cameron had come up with himself. But one of the things that he started to do later on was he innovated a bit, and he created a kind of sensory deprivation room. I can't remember, in some stables in the medical facility, in the psychiatric facility in Canada. So he was associated with McGill University, and now the name escapes me of the hospital where he carried this out, but it was associated with McGill in Canada. And so there was some stables, and he got the stables converted, made sensory deprivation rooms. But compared to Heb, these were not informed consent. People couldn't just leave; they were prevented from leaving. And then he would give them lots of different a cocktail of drugs, essentially, including lots of hallucinogenics, so LSD, maybe other hallucinogenics. And so one person, gives an account of not being able to move, having had all of this ECT, all this kind of psychic driving, and at the same time, hallucinating wildly. And we know hallucinations, they could be pleasant, but hallucinations on psychedelics are extremely sensitive to what your environmental situation is. And if you're in a frightening situation, you're going to have really, really bad, hallucinogenic trips. So this was clearly a very frightening and unpleasant situation. So people would have horrific hallucinations. So yes, the snakes thing, I think, was probably, hallucination because of hallucinogenics given to that person because of the situation they were in. And the end result, although Cameron claimed that he had positive results, pretty soon after, because he died actually, very sadly, but he died very soon after he was resigned from his place. I can't remember if he was forced to resign, but basically, while he was still, a leading figure at the institution, these experiments continued. Not necessarily funded by MkUltra at the end, because I'm not sure where MkUltra. I think it maybe finished funding in 62, 63, but he died pretty soon afterwards. And the hospital did a review, and they ceased all of those experiments pretty soon afterwards, because they thought they had no benefit. And then years later, a very brave and campaigning group of ex-patients tried to take the CIA to court. And after years and years and years of negotiations, they did receive some money. They were given some money by the Canadian government as well, but lots of people lost out because for various reasons about they didn't meet the right criteria, and they also had to promise not to sue the Canadian government again. So it had absolutely horrific damage on people. Nobody came out of this well, and some people were significantly affected for the rest of their lives. Most people couldn't work. Most people, their memory was absolutely, shot, really. And it was, incredibly unethical. And yet this guy was, at the time, the president of the World Psychiatric Association. I think it was the American Psychiatric Association, possibly the Canadian Psychiatric Association. So, he wasn't, he was a maverick figure in some ways, but he was also like a major establishment figure. And back in the 50s and 60s, people didn't disagree with what their doctors, recommended to them. So lots of people went into these, what they didn't realize were actually experimental research studies. They went in thinking that, things would be positive, and then came out, even worse than they went in. He even did one of these experiments on somebody who came to him for a job. Another medical professional went to him for an interview for a job, and he, during the interview, decided that she had all kinds of anxiety problems, and she was put into one of these programs, and she managed to kind of get out after a couple of weeks. Kind of a bizarre and amazing kind of story, really.
Do you just push can you, like, is it just the blame on Ewen Cameron, or what about the universities? I mean, they had to know what was going on or what experiments he was doing, but I guess it was that established figure presence that you really didn't question, because if he's doing research, he's a well-respected name, then he's probably doing some good work or something like that. And you don't even think twice about looking into it. But I would have to think a number of people would be able to raise their voice up. I mean, I've looked into survivors about MKUltra, and that's just, they're very shy, at least what I've seen, what I've experienced, about talking about some of these experiences as well too. But it's also MKUltra, most of the documentation was destroyed on MKUltra. So what you have is, like, you're not going to have maybe a specific account of a person that's really trying to share a real experience, and then they get called a liar, and then eventually they just don't want to talk to anybody about anything, which makes it really hard on them. But I mean, it's a real program, we just don't know to what extent. But I'm curious, like, the number of institutions, names that I see pop up when I'm doing my own research about older projects, I'm like, did they get anything towards them at all for anything like damages or anything like that? Because that's ridiculous. We just usually talk about the main figures, not about a lot about the people that suffered. Or what about the institutions that were letting them do these experiments?
Yeah, I think it's important to put it into context, really. I mean, this stands alone as a pretty egregious example, but I mean, this was also the time when lobotomies were being carried out. Tens of thousands of frontal lobotomies. Again, I mean, these are hardly done these days because they've
Walter
got
Friedman was
very,
going around with no sleeves on his jacket, just touring around the world, giving everybody a little ice pick lobotomy.
yeah. I mean, well, yes, there was gosh, I can't remember the name of I think it was Freeman. There's an
Yeah, Walter
American
Friedman. That's,
psychiatrist who used to perform lobotomies with an ice pick in
yeah,
like 5 minutes without anesthetic, I
it's
think.
nuts,
I
man.
mean, people, psychiatry, I mean, lots of people would say this is an endemic problem with psychiatry over, the last 150 years that it's been around, that, lots of unethical things have happened. People were, psychiatrists, no doubt with the best of intentions, in their search for new therapies, tried all kinds of things, most of which they have no idea why they work. I mean, still, the basis for electroshock is very much disputed. If you look at the history of electroshock, some of the early proponents of electroshock were saying the reason we're giving this to people is to make them lose their memory, because their memories are the thing that's bothering them. But nowadays, contemporary psychiatrists don't really use that argument. But it's clear that ECT does still have kind of memory issues, and there's significant debate about whether it's effective. I know some people feel it's effective, but quite a lot of the research indicates that it's no better, than kind of placebo. So lots of unethical things were happening in the 50s and 60s in psychiatry. I mean, these were the days when you could be put into an asylum for virtually no reason. Women were sent to asylums for having an illegitimate child. People were being given something called insulin coma therapy, where they were basically put to sleep for days and weeks at a time, which is an extremely risky procedure. Lots of people died through procedures like that. Electroshock was a regular occurrence. As I say, lobotomy, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands in the US because of the size of it. So there were lots of unethical things going on. So I think that there just weren't the norms at the time that would have meant that people would have realised this was something, wrong that was going on. It's only with the kind of benefit of hindsight. I mean, maybe the other thing is that there was a huge amount of stigma at the time. I mean, I think in the UK, I think there was one documentary on mental health in the whole of the decade of the 50s. It was such a stigmatized thing. People didn't talk about it to other people. So it would have been very hard for people to speak out about it. And patients didn't really have any rights at that time. Particularly if they were being treated, under compulsory treatment, they would have limited, chance to kind of argue against things. Their relatives would have thought, well, the doctors know what's best, even though it doesn't look very good, maybe it'll have a good outcome. They had hope. And I think a lot of these psychiatrists who gave these experimental procedures, hope for the best. But hoping for the best is not, it's not an ethical kind of position. Lots of them, it was just at the kind of second, rise of what's called biological psychiatry, where you focus on, physical treatments for people, medication, or things like ECT or lobotomy, things like that. So lots of psychiatrists are optimistic, but lots of them, look back with regret. They thought, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't have done these things. But at the time, I think it probably, might have been regarded as odd. I think certainly some people thought that Cameron's research at the time was unethical. Like I said, I think E.O. Harper, who was the Canadian psychologist, apparently he regarded Ewen Cameron as criminally stupid for the kind of research that he was doing. I think Hebb, because he was interested in the way that the mind and the brain worked, how it perceived things, and he was a proper kind of pure researcher. He was aware of how complex the brain and mind were, and just this, Cameron's kind of very simplistic ideas. We can wipe the brain and build a new personality. So lots of people would recognise that it wasn't right, but nobody stood up, and I'm sure McGill University probably feels quite ashamed about its association with her. But I think at the time in the legal actions, I think it was regarded that the CIA were kind of responsible because they ultimately funded and they had the most knowledge of Cameron's research. McGill University, I don't know what extent they knew about this research. In those days, people didn't ask too many questions of leading authority figures like doctors. And in the CIA, as you say, I can't remember which CIA director it was, but one of them decided that they should destroy, I think at Ascot Lieb, they destroyed all the records because they were afraid of what might come out. What they forgot, however, and maybe Stephen Kinzer mentioned this, was that the CIA as a bureaucracy kept lots of financial records. So they destroyed all the records from the offices, but they need to know where all the money's gone. So subsequently, somebody found boxes of financial records, and the author, the man who wrote this book, which was the kind of major book at the time, the Search for the Manchurian Candidate, he put in a Freedom of Information Act request, and they found boxes of these financial records, and he did an incredible research project tracing the history of the MkUltra project, and actually, because this was still in the 70s, was able to interview some of the key figures at the time. But yeah, I think lots of people involved were overly optimistic, reckless in funding and conducting these studies, fearful about what the Soviet Union, and the communist countries were doing, fearful about why, American soldiers in Korea, appeared to be victims of what was called brainwashing at the time. So there was lots of reasons why these things happen, but yeah, the fact that it was hidden from public accountability was a major point.
I was going to ask you about where you got your documentation from for like I have the benefit of the internet where I can go to the Internet Archive and be able to see like all John Marks put up all the receipts and everything. I mean, it's so weird when you see like 500,000 or however much money sent for LSD or something like that, but then there's no account of what it was used for. There's no follow up on that. It's just a receipt basically. So, but I can find these things on like the Internet Archive and the work that all these researchers did that they were able to publish. I'm curious where you were able to find yours, and did you come across any survivor accounts? Did you happen to do any interviews?
Yeah, I mean, my research. I mean, this isn't a major area of research for me. I mean, I've written a couple of articles and chapters. I mean, most of my research is secondary, really. So I've not looked at many primary sources, but there are survivor accounts out there. I mean, the Canadian experiments. There's at least 2 or 3 books by. Which are either collections of accounts by survivors. I think one's called The Sleep Room. There's also an account by an American psychiatrist or a psychiatrist in the US whose father was, subject to treatment by Ewen Cameron. There's another book. There was actually a Canadian TV drama that dramatized the results of this. There were some investigations by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in the 1980s, and so yeah, so there's lots of survivor accounts out there, because obviously lots of these people are, very old now or are deceased, because this stuff was happening in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, I've not done lots of primary research, but the research that's out there is pretty not sufficient, but it goes into as much detail as possible, I think.
You have a lot of knowledge for not having this as your primary research, man. That's insane. Like I said, looking up stuff on the internet, I can find the Internet Archive and find just documents, but trying to find people who are like openly speaking about MKUltra and researching it, besides Stephen Kinzer and maybe a couple other names I've probably talked to at some point, but there's not a whole lot of people. Like even when I mention MKUltra, a lot of kids my generation go, "What is that?" And I go, what? What do you mean? What is that? It's important. Like, and the weird thing is the CIA uploaded a bunch of documents about it and just didn't say anything, just kind of uploaded it up there. And then a bunch of people started writing articles like The Intercept was. And I look at it, I was like, yeah, they're not going to promote what they did. That's kind of their dirty laundry, but they're just going to put it up there for you to read, which is interesting in its own. I don't know. Looking at these documents, it's, I don't know, it's eerie for me just because it's like it's history, but it's like this was going on at the time and it seems so far removed from what I guess a lot of people think about now. What do you, I mean, after learning all this stuff about MKUltra, did you have different thoughts about maybe from before to compared to after?
I mean, I think one of the first things is I guess MKUltra has kind of got a kind of popular culture kind of aspect to it now. I mean, it's become one of those kind of conspiracy theory memes, and lots of things tend to get lumped in that actually, weren't one of the funded projects. So I think, yeah, there's a way in which it's become bigger than its actual historical reality. I mean, I think there's huge amounts to learn there about the ethics of research. Why is it? I mean, as a researcher, and somebody has to complete ethics applications. Lots of people. It's seen often as a very bureaucratic procedure, but these are the reasons why we need to give, inform people who you want to be a participant in your research, like what it's about, what the risks and benefits are. So it's really about the kind of importance of research ethics. It's also about what governments and particularly military and intelligence and security agencies, what can happen if fear and a lack of accountability come into the picture. Things that you thought were well established in the past, that these things don't really work and they're unethical. that how quickly that can be forgotten when you have policymakers who are stricken by fears about future attack. I mean that there was a lot of fear during the Cold War about what was happening in the communist bloc, and particularly what was happening to soldiers in Korea. There was a lot of fear after 9/11 about about future attacks. But fear isn't a good basis for a strategy, really. And so it's important. And often people can be quite arrogant. We don't want to know about the history. We've got all the information we need. And there was a kind of cavalier attitude to making exactly the same mistakes that have been made decades before. So I would hope that in the future that people are a bit more thoughtful about this. I mean, with the more recent techniques in the US, there was lots of investigations over the last few years. The Senate conducted an investigation. I think
I saw something about psychic weapons that they talked about, and I was like, that sounds conspiracy even to me. But then I think even Biden made a statement about it too at one of their conferences I showed on here at one point, where I was like, we
oh,
have
you mean
technology
Havana
to.
syndrome?
No. There was mentioning something else about using some type of weapon that emits a sound or something. It causes confusion or something like that. It sound conspiracy to me. I swear to you, this is real though. But I showed the article on air, and they made White House made a statement about it in one of their conferences because sadly they said that it might have exposed to a small number of a population they didn't mean to. So he was making an apology about it. And I go, what are we talking about? Like I've read the church committee, and a heart attack gun is pretty insane. Like I was like, oh my God, but they talked about MkUltra as well too. But then when we're looking at the technology they use now, I mean, distorting riots with using sound, I have no clue. But that just all seems like sci-fi movie to me. But it's also because a lot of the public's generally disconnected from, a lot of this technology as well too. I mean, unless you're in the military and you're aware of what's going on. But I don't know. Everything sounds like a sci-fi movie now.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's lots of kind of research going on, and I mean, there's like things like non-lethal weapons, and things that are being done with sound. I mean, I think with the psychological interrogation stuff, I mean, there was a congressional investigation just a few years ago where there ended up being a standoff between the CIA and the committee because the committee wanted to reveal more information than the CIA wanted them to. But I think it's been pretty well established. I mean, I think that was done under the Obama administration. I think it's pretty well established that although nobody was prosecuted at that time, that they didn't want to go down that path again. And similarly, the American Psychological Association, brought in a lawyer to do a long investigation for the involvement of some of the psychologists who'd been involved. And I think over the last few months, I think there's an ongoing case with the two psychologists who were involved with the CIA high value detainee program. They're being sued, personally, I think. So the US government allowed those cases to go ahead. So I think the problem is that the knowledge of history only lasts for a while. The people who have experienced it are around, and then within a few decades, people will have forgotten that again. And then if something happens in the future, then all of that kind of knowledge will be lost again. So, one of the reasons that I, continue to, speak about it and write about it has been, I think it's an important thing for psychologists to bear in mind because, mental health researchers have, been involved with developing some of this knowledge in the past, and we need to keep in mind why it's unethical, that the fact that it's not that effective. Or even if you produce some true information, there's an awful lot of false information. So you're not necessarily in any better position. So yeah, I think it's important to both for psychologists, but also for the wider public and policymakers, to remember the lessons of history. Really.
Do you ever think Ewen Cameron had maybe some thoughts about where he was getting all these drugs from? Like if the government, could have been funding, I would have think they're like, hey, why is this university constantly getting LSD and all these other types of psychedelic drugs? Like, what is it? Do we just have a whole storage shed somewhere? I would think you'd have questions about like, hey, where's this all coming from?
I think no, I think the only thing you got from the CIA was money. So I think he bought all those drugs himself because, as a medical facility, hallucinogenics were, it was legal to prescribe them at the time. I mean, this was the heyday of the, Timothy Leary and other experiments, that those drugs were only kind of criminalized, I think, towards the end of the 60s. In the US, so it was legal for doctors to buy them and to distribute them. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I've not looked into the history, but my understanding is it's still unclear whether he really knew. I think I think the main contact he had with the CIA would send somebody. I can't remember the name of the person who they sent, but it was possibly a psychologist. But they were sent by the CIA under the cover of from this funding body, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. So he would have had a meeting with that person every now and again. He would receive funds from that organisation, but more than that, we don't know. I mean, Cameron, clearly wanted funding for his studies. So, I mean, often when you want funding for studies, people might be less bothered about the source of it. So he was probably quite happy that there was somebody prepared to fund these studies. Probably didn't ask too many questions about where it's coming from. Since it was a body at Cornell University, it would have looked legit. I mean, there were other researchers who also gained money for research that they were wanting to do without knowing the source of the funding.
Joy
They
on
knew.
West is a good example.
Sorry?
Luis Joy on West is a good example of that one.
Okay.
He found out about it later, but he was the one in charge of Operation Midnight Climax. His name he denied it till I guess till he died. But it's only from the work of Tom O'Neill, who was actually able to interview him. And then it all started coming out after he died that he was part of the MkUltra project. Drugging hippies, or drugging random people, putting drugs in their coffee and having them like have freakouts and stuff like that. It's a little bit controversial if it was against the hippie movement or not, but like you can look up his letters. I think he was at Harvard, that go to his students talking about, we're going to go to these Haight-Ashbury clinics dressed up like hippies and do this whole experiment that they were going to do. And to me, I don't know. It's obviously clearly unethical, but it was like, you didn't find out about really any of that stuff till he died. He denied it every time everyone would bring it up. But if you looked up his career afterwards, major hypnosis guy, was a professional doctor in the field of hypnosis, would hypnotize celebrities and things of that sort, which to me is just like, dang, he had a full-fledged career after all that MKUltra stuff.
Yeah, and lots of people, what I mean, some of the people knew that the CIA was the source of funding. Some of them didn't, and some of them, if they were given a choice, would have preferred not to be named or not to know the source of the funding because they were worried about what it would do to their career. I mean, this was, later in the 60s with, protests about Vietnam and so on, lots of people will be concerned about that. So, yeah, I don't know the name of the person you're mentioning there, but certainly there were, I think that there was somebody, wasn't there, an ex-narcotics officer who was involved in organising prostitutes for some of those experiments. I think there was one in San Francisco where they were
That's the Haight-Ashbury
got
clinics.
prostitutes to spike drinks in order to see what the effects of LSD would be on unsuspecting people. I mean, a lot of this was started because they had lots of optimism about the possibilities of these new chemicals that were around. I mean, LSD was discovered in like the first half of the 20th century. It hadn't really found a use. That I think they were also trying marijuana. They tried other drugs. They were also looking for a truth drug that they could give to people, who they were trying to interrogate, spies and so on. But I think, what they found was that none of these chemicals were that useful. LSD had very unpredictable effects on people, and there was no truth drug as such. I mean, most of those drugs, that they were giving as truth drugs, kind of just. I mean, I've actually seen, when I was working in a security hospital, where in maximum security hospital, where somebody had committed an offence, was given. It's something like there are drugs like sodium pentothal. I can't remember the exact thing, but it was in the same class. And the person just became a bit more disinhibited, a bit like they were drunk, although they weren't slurring the words. But it's not like you get a video of what their memory is. They're still having to communicate through language, and you have to be very careful not to ask leading questions. I was observing a psychiatrist interviewing somebody, and the questions were a little bit leading, a little bit all over the place. So we didn't learn a huge amount that we didn't already know. This was back in the 1980s. So a lot of these things were people were being over optimistic about what these chemicals could do. And I think the US military were interested in LSD because they were looking for what they called an incapacitant, so something that would knock soldiers out without necessarily killing them. Although I think they gave up LSD because they found something even more powerful. There was a chemical called BZ that basically incapacitates people for 3 days, whereas LSD, 8 hours or something. But, this thing would be send people out of it for 3 days. So, but, it's not really been those things. I guess the times, if you wanted to use it, the times when those things are going to be useful, it's not really ever been used. I guess it would class as a chemical weapon, but it's it's hard to think of exactly what kind of things that might be used for. So again, there was a whole program of research driven by optimism, recklessness, fear, no doubt a wish for career success.
Could I ask what you would consider parts of MkUltra that would be conspiracy, like would enter the conspiracy realm? Because like the Operation Midnight Climax, the one you mentioned about the prostitutes, that's Julian West's program. But even with that, and I had said this long before Tucker Carlson had said it, and others had said it long before Tucker Carlson said it. I think it comes out of Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos. But Luis Julian West had visited Jack Ruby, the killer of Oswald, and it's a part that I have the documentation on to back it up. Gave him the psychiatric exams. Now, his name is stamped at the bottom of that, which I just think is he's an MkUltra guy. It's very weird. He's visiting Ruby, and that's when Ruby makes like a famous statement saying he gave me cancer. Now, you can't prove what's in his shot. You can't do that. Like I could find at an Ohio penitentiary 2 years before, they had injected prisoners with cancer cells. So there's evidence of a history of that that is recorded. But then I can't prove what was in his shot that they gave Ruby. But they gave him 200 x-rays in a matter of 2 weeks with 1967 radiology equipment. And that's on the Parkland medical receipt. And where Julian West comes in is that 5 psychiatrists visited Ruby. And the only one to give him a flu shot for walking pneumonia was Luis Julian West. And that's when Tucker Carlson had said it in a very crappy version without like any documents to back it up. He had given a really summarized version of it. And I was like, well, Ruby died of cancer like 2 weeks later. I'm not saying they injected him with anything cancer related, or he was having just horrible hallucinations when Julian West was his psychiatrist, is the issue. Where I start going, I would put more weight into that being some type of MkUltra instance. Not saying it was, super, super conspiracy. Stay with me on it. But I mean, he's bashing his head up against a cell door, talking about horrible visions of Jews burning in streets. Like his mind was something had snapped in that one visit. And then these constant months afterwards just started declining so fast, where I was like, out of all the doctors you could have had visited Ruby, you had an MkUltra guy in there. And I can't, sadly, with MkUltra, I don't know the full extent of what it went. And I'm not trying to be a conspiracy person, but I'm looking at these documents and stuff that John Marks left behind. And I was like, I want to try and find a reasonable answer to this. But at the same time, I kind of can't because they don't have anything for me to look into to say this was rationalized by this. It's kind of just like a dead end. And it's one of those one of a side things. I mean, I'm curious, what would you consider that a conspiracy? I mean, that's fine if you do. I'm not going to be offended by it, but I don't know. Like to me, like I said, I'm trying to find root in what's truth. There are little bits of truth here and there, and I want to make sure that it doesn't get too far over into the conspiracy realm because I think it's really important for people to see the history and also understand it as well too.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know enough about the kind of Jack Ruby incident and JFK, I'm afraid. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't want to kind of make a comment because I just don't feel I know enough about it really. I mean, I think the danger with these things is that there were all kinds of unethical experiments carried out in psychiatry. There were unethical experiments carried out, within medicine. There was the Tuskegee experiments. The syphilis experiments. There were all kinds of things going on. But whether any of that was kind of used later on, with the case that you're mentioning, yeah, I just wouldn't know really. I mean, there can be lots of reasons why people, make the statements that they do, or have kind of, mental health reactions to things. So yeah, I wouldn't really want to comment it. I
It's
think.
hard because I'm trying to understand it as much as I can just about history because I have an interest in history, but also coming at it with a more balanced approach. Like you can't look at it with the mindset of 23. You have to look at it like in the time of the 60s, which maybe you have to learn more about the Cold War. And also like try not to put your own personal feelings into it. But the unethical stuff is where that becomes a problem because when I start seeing people who have you ever looked into the church committee before? Um,
Um, yeah, I mean, a little bit. Yeah, to the extent that it kind of, relayed into the kind of MkUltra stuff. I mean, clearly, the intelligence agencies were doing things that were beyond their remit. I mean, again, it's the same story. I mean, the FBI and COINTELPRO. Because I'm another of my interests is in kind of the history of surveillance technologies, and massively unethical things that didn't resist being shown the light of day. And often people involved in those things were doing things because they were secret, but if they had to justify them to the public, they wouldn't have survived. So I think it's good that those investigations kind of happened, and that things, certainly in the US, there's probably more oversight. I mean, there is oversight in the UK, but it's got less kind of teeth than it does in the US. So I think that's that's a good thing that those things came out. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, in the kind of conspiracy realm, because that if things are being kept hidden by security and intelligence agencies, people tend to think, well, it's because the thing is true. Like for instance, at the moment with the UFO stuff, there's lots of people
I don't
wondering why
even know what
things
to
are.
think about that, man. That's
Well,
so
quite. But I think one of the things that people forget is well, often people are trying to cover up. There's bureaucratic inertia. So it takes a lot of energy to overturn these things. Secondly, people are often very defensive. I mean, particularly after major terrorist incidents or when things have gone wrong, bureaucracies go into cover-up mode. They're extremely defensive about things. So it doesn't necessarily mean, and particularly when you talk about security and intelligence agencies, or the security of the skies, they're all absolutely paranoid about people knowing what they know, what their sensors will detect. So if you've got, high-end sensors on aircraft, and then you've got to disclose exactly what those sensors can see, well, then you're going to be worried that your adversary is going to work that out and then find ways of circumventing that. So I think a lot of the stuff that's not being released about UFOs is probably more to do with bureaucratic politics, and a kind of fear about giving away what they call, sources, information on sources and methods. That's the kind of things that, intelligence agencies that's their bread and butter. So I think, yeah, sometimes people are worried that things are being covered up because, there's really stuff about aliens, or there's, conspiracies true, like the JFK stuff. I think the reason the most recent stuff, I mean, I've not gone through it in any detail, but I did notice some of the stuff that came out was basically all the stuff that revealed that the CIA were monitoring the Russian embassy in Mexico. So the main reason that's not being released is not necessarily to do with the content of it. It's because obviously something's changed more recently, that they're now okay about releasing the information that with the participation of some Mexican intelligence and security people, that they were monitoring the Soviet embassy. But I'm guessing that that's the kind of thing that they don't want to release, although clearly the FBI and CIA have some information that's embarrassing, so no doubt that was another factor. But I suspect it's more that they didn't want to let on that they knew about things. I doubt it's that they kind of knew things were going to, lead to JFK's assassination and decided to let it go on.
it's
But I'm
they
not an expert in this area.
the CIA and the FBI withheld, and this been released previously. And even I had Blakey from the HSCA, who's House Select Committee assassinations that prove probable conspiracy and the likelihood of Jack Ruby shooting Oswald. I had him on here. He feels though obviously the CIA withheld stuff from him, whether it was for national security or not. But the Warren Commission's investigation, we just know a lot more than we do in 63, which is that they were watching Oswald for up to 4 years. They dropped the threat on him, which you're supposed to alert any Secret Service members of a threat to the president. But they dropped the threat on Oswald a week before he had came to Dallas. So that's why they weren't alerted. Like I said, trying to find the reasonable answers, but there's so much stuff where it's like, you guys really didn't even attempt to like sort out if there was a conspiracy. Like within 48 hours, you eliminate the fact there could be a getaway driver. What do you explain by that? Bad police work? I guess so. And I'll chalk it up to that. But like I said, I'm not as crazy or conspiracy. I'm really trying to find the root in all this. Like with the church committee is a good example, because out of critical as it was a whitewash. And people go, what? It exposed so much. I'm like, true. But at the ending of the thing, they never uh, said what the CIA's budget was. They never, so many things that were brought up that CIA said, we don't feel like we need to address that. And they just shut it down. I'm like, if it's a committee to expose what our intelligence agencies are doing, then there should be some damages, right? Nobody really paid a price. I think even there's a bad article that was listed, said the CIA would never recover from this to their reputation. Seems like they're doing okay now. Everyone kind of moved on past it, but the balance to that is that if you talk, like I've talked to people in intelligence who study intelligence operations and are very focused on, like, mostly from the UK, they study like UK intelligence stuff. They said, well, William Colby, they had two people beside him that were telling him, you can't expose this because we have people overseas and you're putting them at risk. I'm okay with that. 100%. I agree. I don't want to put those people at risk at all. But when we start talking about like other things, like I get the budget's national security issues, it's just about finding what that balance is. Not everything needs to be some grandiose conspiracy. Like I've talked to many members of the Assassination Records Review Board on JFK, government funded, like federal Judge Thunheim. The issue that arises with that is that when he requests for documents about prior death threats to Kennedy, then 2 weeks later, after requesting it, the Secret Service destroyed those. Like he even says, I don't believe conspiracy. I believe Oswald did it, but what the hell is that about? And it's like, see, that's the thing. It's like, what is these things that you can't describe? Bad police work or covering up the fact that you didn't do your job properly. It doesn't always need to be some grand CIA did it or anything like that. That's a dumb question. You don't need to know who did it. You just need to talk about, we know a lot more from 63. Sorry, I get a little ranty on
No,
the
it's all right.
JFK
I
subject,
mean,
but
there's certainly a huge amount of material, isn't there, out there, both in terms of evidence and stuff that's written. So, yeah, there's a lot to go through there. But yeah, I wouldn't claim any expertise in that area.
it's just like I said, it's that conspiracy thing. Even when I talk about the MkUltra subject, some people I've talked to that are real 100% like everybody's brainwashed. I mean, do you ever think that they were successful at anything when it came to one of those sleeper agents or anything like that? Like, I haven't seen anything documentation wise to prove it, but I would think after so many different trials, you'd find one person, maybe a fringe person who might have a certain disorder. I know eventually they were looking for people that had that split personality or that bipolar thing. That could be conspiracy, like I said.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I don't know. I mean, I certainly. I think there was well, probably around the same time I bought the Operation Mind Control in the '70s when I was my late teens. I think there was a book called Control of Candy Jones, which is one of the earliest books of that kind of thing, where they were supposedly trying to train people with.
On
Well,
the
get
radio, on the radio is what it was.
okay, but there's yeah, I think nowadays it will be people with a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether those things, I have not looked into that side of things. I'm not aware if there's kind of documentary evidence backing that up. But yeah, I'm not aware of any of these cases that have kind of worked out. I mean, on the operational side, these things are always far messier than people like to let on. I mean, in the experiments that were done, I mean, most of these experiments, certainly the kind of Cameron type experiments and the drugs experiments, revealed that the drugs are unpredictable. That's why they were never really used, in operations. The supposed mind control experiments didn't find what they were looking for, or people like Cameron would claim that he was effective, but nobody's using those techniques because everybody has realised that they've done far more harm than good. I mean, I think maybe some knowledge was gained out of some programs. I mean, a lot of the programs were things that researchers were doing anyway. It's just that they got a handy source of research. I mean, I think like something like EO had would probably, might well have done that research anyway because he was learning something about how the brain, perceives. I mean, prior to those kinds of studies, people didn't realize the brain is actively processing all the time. The reason why people hallucinate, one of the theories is that if your senses are deprived, the brain's still actively trying to generate things. So if it hasn't got any input, it starts to make up the input itself. So yeah, I think most of it was pretty unsuccessful, but people who were trying to maybe answer some basic research questions maybe found out some things, but I'm not aware that much came out of it. And a lot of the interrogation techniques, kind of developed, in parallel, really. I mean, the enhanced interrogation techniques, things like putting people in stress positions, that a lot of that came from the history of like torture, the so-called five techniques that the KGB and its predecessors used, in the 20s and 30s. Lots of this information gets passed around, within kind of amongst torturers, back in history, and people have learned from those techniques. I mean, I think some of the enhanced interrogation techniques that probably do owe something to this research are, things where people have given HUDs, the use of sound, repetitive. People would have like very bizarre music played to them. I think Barney the dinosaur, in Iraq, I think, or Afghanistan. Detainees will be played these bizarre records over and over again just to kind of reduce their kind of defenses. And so, yeah, the manipulation of sound, the manipulation of heat, stress positions, things like that. So some of them, develop from the history of torture. Some of them develop from research like this.
Mr. Harper, I'm just gonna ask you one more question, but it's about, did you see the MKUltra movie that came out recently?
No, I've not seen that yet. Is that the one with Anson Mount in it? Is
I
it?
think so. It's like they shouldn't have called it MK Ultra. I actually had to delete the link when I shared it because I was actually really upset by it. They made it kind of weird, like they seemed like that like a kid comes in, he's about to get like a lobotomy, basically they're about to give him a lobotomy, and they go, we can enroll you in this new program called MK Ultra, and we're gonna load you up into it. And it made it seem like that it was better than getting a lobotomy, where I was like, that's not what it was, but okay. And so but it's definitely interesting. They included some things like the two-way glass, or the not two-way glass, but the one-way glass, where you could watch people and see with them experiment and freak out and stuff. But I don't know. I think if even from your knowledge on MK Ultra, you would be able to look at it and be like, yeah, this is not really a good accurate depiction of what MK Ultra was. So I would recommend it. That and Wormwood by Frank Olson's kid. I don't know if you've ever seen that one as well
I
too.
did see that. Yeah, yeah. No, I thought it was interesting. It was a little bit slow going, but it was interesting. Yeah, I'm just trying to think whether I've seen a good. I mean, like I say, there's something you can get it on YouTube. Actually, I think it's called the Sleep Room, the Canadian broadcaster dramatization. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've seen anything that's been good
I'll
on that.
find it. Trust me. As soon as you mentioned it, I was like making a
Oh
mental
no,
note.
I've seen the advert for the one you've mentioned, but I was trying to think if there were other better ones out there. But my memory escapes me at the moment.
Well, Mr. Harper, I appreciate the time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links? If you have any social media handles, any websites, anything you'd like to promote?
Yeah, I mean, my website, if you Google David Harper, University of East London, I'll probably pop up in Google. Yeah, I've got a website which lists my publications, but yeah, I'm not active on social media, I'm afraid. There's far too much electronic communication, but you can drop me a line. You can find my email online if you Google me.
And I'll link your websites in the description for people to be able to click on and check out your links. And thank you so much for giving me the time. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.